Well, we see there's been a divide in the US on gun policy. A majority of Democrats favor creating a federal database to track all gun sales and ban assault weapons. So, what is driving Democrats to make their decision on gun policy?
Well, what's driving them is, one would argue, are the facts. The facts of the matter are that we do have a lot of gun violence in the United States because they have a lot of guns, and it seems to correlate. So the right is typically in favor of restrictions, but they've got a long road to hoe. Part of the problem is that you've got a wide swath of the country that's being represented by 5 or 6 or 7 senators in state, and they each get 2 votes, even though they have a lower number of population, and that population is less in favor of restricting guns. So they're representing their constituents' interests, but not the interest of the nation writ large. And that's a gap that is built into American politics and is next to impossible to resolve.
How does viewers understand why is there such a divide in the US when it comes to gun control? Well, the perception is that the Americans are either completely pro-gun or anti-gun. Why is that?
In part because polarization. Again, we touched on it earlier, where you've got a very rigid Republican Party and a Democratic Party that's been being told by its supporters to not compromise. So there's no political middle. Back in the 50s and the 60s, when there were such things as moderate Republicans and even liberal Republicans, we don't have that anymore. We have conservative Democrats, we have liberal Democrats, we have moderate Democrats. But in the Republican Party, if you don't toe the conservative line, chances are you're going to get primaried from the right. Some party challenger is going to come from the right and have the potential to knock you off because the Republican Party has become very intransigent on this issue. So polarization is the leading cause of this. There's no middle, and where there's no middle, there's very little opportunity to compromise.
So how does the structure of the Senate impact gun policymaking?
Right. We touched on this earlier. The structure of the Senate is such that every state in the United States gets 2 U.S. senators. And that's true of California, one of the most populous states in the country, as it is true of Wyoming, which doesn't have very many people in it relative to those, relative to that state. So that means even though there are more people in California than there are in Wyoming, Wyoming still has the same amount of political power. They still have the same 2 votes that California does. More people want guns in Wyoming, fewer people want guns in California. Therefore, the power negates each other. And unless there's a supermajority in the Senate, or unless one party has a very, very clear advantage in the Senate, gun policy tends to go nowhere. That's even true of the fact that the Senate is constructed with this thing called the filibuster that you may have heard a lot about. The filibuster is not necessarily an instrument that will protect gun rights, but they're using it as such. They're using the filibuster to block any legislation that would enhance gun control, that would help get these weapons of war off the streets. The problem there is you've got a very, very closely divided Senate, and 1 or 2 senators on the Democratic side refuse to get rid of the filibuster, which would allow a simple majority rule vote. And even though Democrats technically have control of the Senate and technically could pass gun legislation on their own, the filibuster allows Republicans to block such legislation. So it ends up going nowhere.
Well, Joseph, I want to get your final thoughts on the gun debate. Are changes really possible, and what might that look like in the ideal world?
Well, change is always possible, and as long as we have a democratic system, it's possible. Likely is a word I really don't want to use at this particular moment. We do hear reports coming out of Capitol Hill that bipartisan talks are continuing, that this moment was so egregious, that the failure of law enforcement was so bad, and that the facts were so horrific that something has to be done. And I think Republicans even recognize that. Now, is it going to lead to meaningful legislation? We don't know. It could lead to some tinkering around the edges, which any progress is good progress. But until we get a handle on what to do about the assault weapons, until we get a handle on how to ratchet down the climate of fear on the right and the sense of paranoia, real meaningful progress is hard to see at this point. And it's more likely that we're going to have another spree shooting, another shooting where people are slaughtered, where innocents are slaughtered, than it is we're going to have meaningful reform to stop it.